In 1987, the University of Chicago professor Alan Bloom published one of the most unlikely bestsellers in modern American history. The closing of the American mind began by looking into the tastes and aspirations and even the deeper spiritual longings of the students in Bloom's classroom, and observed that they were gripped by a deep commitment to equality of all things, to such an extent, in fact, that they were reluctant to exercise moral judgment. Relativism was the name that Bloom gave to describe this condition, the unwillingness to say or the inability to discern differences between virtue and vice, between the Allied and Axis powers in World War II, between democratic self-government and tyranny. A nation of American readers was electrified by Bloom's portrait of his students. Fewer of them ventured on to the later sections of the book, where Bloom then proposed an intellectual genealogy of where these ideas came from, of the sources and the provenance and the patrimony of the condition of the American mind. He thought that Nietzsche and Heidegger, and to some extent Max Weber, had been imported into the American Academy, where their ideas were tamed and domesticated, and the tragic civilizational crisis of the loss of meaning that those German thinkers had identified and perhaps even hastened, turned in America into a shallow and easy non-judgmentalism. In this month's feature essay in Mosaic, the Egyptian-American writer Hussein Aboubakr Mansour undertakes a similarly breathtaking exercise in intellectual history and deep regime analysis, looking at the ideas that animate and enchant the Arab mind. How did the Arab world come to think what it thinks? Now, that's necessarily a kind of abstraction, but a necessary one if we're going to try and understand the deeper currents of ideology and habits of mind that structure the thinking of Arab intellectuals. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow at Tikva and the editor of Mosaic, and I'm joined in this conversation by, of course, Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, and two very wonderful guests, the head of the Middle East Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University, Professor Ze'ev Maghen, and Professor Bernard Haykel, from the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton. Gentlemen, welcome. So here's how I thought I'd like to spend our time together. I want to ask you, Hussein, to recapitulate the main themes and arguments that you undertake in the essay. Then I'd like to turn to each of our guests to offer some of their own analysis, and we'll have a conversation throughout. Hussein, how did you come to write this essay? What's it about? What's the question that you're trying to answer?
First of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for the wonderful guests for giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. Well, the question of why the Middle East is so dysfunctional has been a major question, not just in Middle East studies, just political science, but it's been even a gnawing question, the central question of Arab societies for quite some time. It took different forms. As I talked in the essay, Bernard Lewis had a major attempt at answering that question. But basically, almost everybody who respects everybody else's intelligence agrees that the Middle East is dysfunctional. It's been producing an enormous amount of political instability, refugees, conflict, new forms or terrible forms of political violence that we saw through jihadism and terrorism starting from the 70s, sadly, until today. I mean, the news constantly, the news cycles are saturated by these news. Not to mention that there's been this has been more discussed in the in political science and international relations department. Basically, what seems to be this Middle Eastern unique resistance to democracy, human rights, liberty, basically all the things that towards the end of the 20th century, the world came to agree to be these liberal virtues of liberal capitalist societies that everybody has an interest for them to be universalized to some extent. The Middle East obviously seemed to always be resistant to this. So the question was born: what's wrong with these societies? What's wrong with these people? And out of this question came specific answers. I think each of them became an intellectual universe of its own, kind of institutionalized in various forms. And these answers obviously are at war with each other. You have, of course, the answer of the established answer of the academic left, which is basically blame imperialism, colonialism, and of course their bastard daughter Zionism. They are basically the cause of all of this enormous instability in the Middle East. Middle Eastern intellectual opinion agrees with it, political opinion. We have an entire regime that builds a lot of ideologies on this, including the Iranian regime. So the answers also are not mere academic exercises. This has real political stakes immediately in life. Ideologies in the Middle East are organized around these answers. Then you have the answer that kind of was measured, especially on for the conservative and right, which Bernard Lewis basically articulated best, which is that there is a problem in Muslim societies itself that can be traced to Islam. That Islam, even if without even moral judgment, Islam just is very different. It's a unique religion that is uniquely hostile to these Western values or Western virtues. It's just a different world that we must understand on its own. This response gets characterized as racist by many people. Some versions of it can definitely become racist, but there are versions of it that actually do try just to see it as some sort of a cultural historical peculiarity. It's just their own world. They have their own values. They just don't live in the way that the West wants to live. And around that answer, as I said, it became a whole universe, even that expanded out of Middle Eastern knowledge about the Middle East itself. Samuel Huntington's major post-Cold War thesis, The Clash of Civilization, was actually built on this. He actually took the sentence from Bernard Lewis specifically talking about the Middle East, and he made it into basically a post-Cold War entire framework to understand history and world politics. So I'm trying to establish basically the stakes of the question, the stakes of the answer. This is not just something about us Arabs and Jews. Obviously, this is something that touches now the entire world.
Hussein, can I just observe that one of the similarities that undergirds both of those proposed answers, both the answer of the left that says a foreign import, colonialism and Zionism and all of that, is responsible for the troubles of the Arabs, and the answer of Bernard Lewis, that there is a Arab culture which, on its own terms, has a kind of integrity, and that integrity has been lost and overcome by modernity, does not fit into modernity well. Both of those answers assume something similar on the part of the agency of Muslim peoples and Arab peoples themselves, that they are acted upon. And it seems to me that one of the answers that you propose is fundamentally different than that. It assumes that the Arabs themselves have agency and are responsible for their own condition.
Exactly. And this is ultimately the reason I've always found, I mean, like everybody else, I jumped between the answers. So you adopt one for a while and then you start playing with it and it doesn't fit anymore. And ultimately, that's really the reason of my satisfaction with it, because it doesn't really explain my own life in Egypt, my understanding of, I saw how things happen. I saw that people have agency. People try to do things actively in society. It just doesn't work out the way that people imagine. We saw this in the Arab Spring when everybody thought that this is about democracy and so on. But basically, yes, both answers actually do assume deep mutual post-Enlightenment epistemology of questions of historical structures, historical forces that act upon agents, or upon the humans, the idea that there are things that happen to us, epochs that suddenly these unitary beings that kind of unfold in history and then they act upon us and so on and so forth. And ultimately, I found those dissatisfactory. And this was my attempt, or the essay of something I've been working on for years, is trying to formulate a new answer that, first of all, recognizes the facts of the dysfunction of the Middle East, doesn't try to find villains and kind of ghosts to blame, but try to actually explain in a coherent, plausible manner that respects the humanity and the agency of everybody involved. What actually did happen? Why is the Middle East dysfunctional?
So what's your answer?
Well, The essay, of course, it challenges the main thesis of the failure. The main thesis basically is the failure to modernize, which is, they couldn't modernize either because imperialism prevented them, or because their own culture prevented them from modernizing. So basically what I'm saying is the crisis, the social crisis, came actually from an intellectual and philosophical crisis. That is tied directly to the university, because we live in an age that is primarily organized around the university. The university matters a lot. The modern middle class society depends on the university to reproduce itself. It is where everybody gets educated. And this institution, or the world of thought, Arab thought, actually, its crisis stems from a radical epistemic shift that is caused not by Arab intellectuals resisting Western thought, but actually adopting it fully, adopting the metaphysics of specifically an anti-Semitic structure of German historicism. So modernity has different strains of thought. It's not just Anglo-American liberalism. There is one of the most powerful strains of modern progressive thought came from 19th century Germany that relies on a specific understanding of history, that orients politics away, or ultimately ended in orienting politics away in the Middle East from traditional Islamic jurisprudence towards a belief in history as a self-sufficient redemptive moral order, moving towards a said destiny, the destiny of the Arabs of self-fulfillment of Islam, so on, and established a new basis of truth that is grounded in this imagined history itself. Now, the argument I make in the essay, first of all, starts with language, talk about how the Arabic language went through this radical transformation in the 19th century that got consummated by the 20th century, and its own moral grammar itself was completely upended by the importation of new concepts of progress, so on and so forth. And then I describe how these concepts acquired their revolutionary nihilistic meaning, specifically in the interwar years, and how this new meaning got institutionalized in the revolutionary regimes that basically made the modern Middle East and made it the mass culture of the Middle East, through which even classical Islamic texts are read. And that's why you have a tendency in the modern Middle East to produce a totalitarian, anti-Western, anti-Semitic reading of any text, whether it was the Quran or a modern text. Kind of the ideology always comes out, this totalitarian, almost always anti-Semitic ideology. And then I provide a reinterpretation of Islamism as basically a continuation of this revolutionary. It's not a return to tradition. It's a continuation of this modern revolution under religious symbolism. And I try to provide a rereading for major Islamist thinkers like Sayyid Qutb, and ultimately trace it to its last nihilistic phase of jihadism, that is basically just becomes a pure spectacle of nihilistic violence.
So that what we're seeing is not as is so often, according to you, inaccurately said, a medieval, antiquated form of Islam that cannot modernize. That's the Lewis thesis, in a characterization of the Lewis thesis. What you're saying is actually what we have here are two rival forms of modern thought that have been manifest and come to life: the Anglo-American liberal tradition and the German postmodern tradition, which is then through which traditional forms and symbols have been reinterpreted. Right. Can you just give us an example of to take something like jihad or another of these symbols or forms, right, that acquires a new meaning, and right, then just lead us through that?
So yeah, you can take pretty much any major symbol or major Islamic institution and actually trace the changes that happened to it from the 18th to 19th to 20th century. Jihad, of course, is a big one because of just jihad. It's now the anxiety of the world. So jihad historically has been two things, had two major meanings, and just in all of Muslim civilizations and various cultures that did exist. It has a strictly religious and spiritual meaning that a lot of people, I think, are familiar with. which is basically the striving to the good against the self, the striving of God in order to become selfless. It exists in all of our world religions. In Christianity, that would be your march to Golgotha in order to just finally let go of yourself to the cross. In Judaism, it would be fulfilling the Torah mitzvah, the commandments, until you yourself internalize or become Torah yourself. That's what really the original, the spiritual meaning. But of course, it wasn't just that. It also had a very wide socio-political and, to use a fixed term, civilizational meaning, if you will, which is basically war. It was the main war tradition of these societies. That did not mean me taking my buddies and go start a group like a Che Guevara, a militia, and go abduct people and behead them. That was not the meaning. No, it was the official tradition of war of the state. It's something that states did. It's something that the Sultan or the Caliph controlled. Of course, you had all of these barbaric practices of medieval warfare, but it was very different. It's really just an official, organized warfare, a tradition that all societies had. You reach the 19th century with the massive push for modernization. The last stage of jihad was actually, if we talk about the Ottoman world, was the Divan Jihadiyya, or the Ministry of Jihad. And the Ministry of Jihad, by the way, did many functions in its last stage that can be today like 9 different ministries. They did, it wasn't just war. They did public works. They did education. They ran schools. The joke is that I tell people this is true. The first Arabic translation of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws were commissioned by the Ministry of Jihad in Egypt, because it was translated by Rifat Tahtawi, who actually worked for the Ministry of Jihad. So they did education as well. By the second half of the 19th century, you have the attempt to build modern states and import all of the institutions. So the Ministry of Jihad was done with, and instead of it, you had the Ministry of War, which was the names of ministries, which by the mid-20th century changed its name again in countries like Egypt and Turkey, following the global example, from the Ministry of War to the Ministry of Defense. So if you really are looking for the institutional continuity of the Ministry of Jihad, it's really these ministries of defense in all of these Muslim countries. Meanwhile, the term jihad itself, in the interwar years specifically, starts to pop up in secular ideological writings, a lot of it actually by Levantine Christians, to translate the German concept of Kampf, which is basically the struggle through which the historical agent, whether a nation, whether a self, whether a civilization, a culture, depending on the version of that imagination, has to engage in history to realize itself. You create yourself through that Kampf, you create yourself through that struggle. History is the slaughter bench, or the court is a judgment of the world, and it happens through that jihad, through that struggle. And this concept then becomes central to the way these revolutionary ideologies happen. There are other words that actually translated as well, kifah and nidal. And then after the collapse of that secular revolutionary struggle that was primarily taken by Arab nationalism, then jihad gets reintegrated into a now reinvented or rediscovered Islam, but after already it has acquired all of these epistemic existential meaning of endless struggle into religious thought. So what happens in effect, that you have religious thought dissolves into revolutionary thought, and you get a new concept of jihad read into Islamic texts that really its own ideological content is from early 20th century or 19th century Germany.
But described always in classical religious vocabulary, even
right.
though the content of those thoughts, in your argument, emerge out of this
right.
messianic, radical German tradition.
And that what creates ultimate confusion for everyone involved, right? Like the conversations about jihad. So you see all of these jihadist groups who are claiming to do jihad, or by the way, not incidentally, celebrated by Western group that also trace their ideological genealogy to these same philosophies, by the way. Here, I hope these things have been bewildering people for a very long time, but now I hope people now see the the relevance and the deep connections between all of these movements and real ideas. It's confusing because you see an Islamic symbol that really does look, Islamic, but people are fighting of its meaning. The classical meaning is only used in apologetics. So you have somebody who comes and you talk about jihadism, and somebody tells you, "Oh, you're wrong. You're wrong. Jihad means this absolutely purifying spiritual struggle." So they are not wrong, but that's not really actually what's been happening.
But Hussein, just to be very, very prosaic and practical about it, what you're saying is that if you want to unpuzzle the riddle of why it is that blue-haired protesters in the streets of European capitals and North American capitals, that progressives of that kind are linking arm in arm with the Islamist radicals of the Middle East, your argument is actually they share very deep down, despite the fact that they express themselves in different ways, they
Right.
share the same intellectual provenance.
Exactly. They are all the children of Fanon, one way or the other. Fanon, who's kind of the theologian of the of murderous, decolonial murderous rage, was actually read very enthusiastically when he first came out in the Middle East. Actually, Sohail Idris, the editor of Al-Adab, major radical publication in Lebanon, immediately translated the book. Immediately translated the introduction for The Wretched of the Earth, the famous, very violent book. And the introduction was much worse. It was written by Sartre. Everybody agrees it's even much more violent and nihilistic than the text itself. Was translated immediately and publicized in the Middle East because Sartre was the intellectual superstar at the time. A lot of its ideas got incorporated into the Palestinian movement specifically. That applied a lot of these violent ideas, also ideas of Roger de Bray, but Fanon that comes directly to the violence. And that violence then gets, in the 70s, Islamized and becomes jihadism. So basically the jihadist, even if he doesn't know, is actually continuing things that really was legitimated and justified by Fanon. And this has been happening in the Western University, in the American university for quite some time. They read Fanon. I mean, read the latest. I asked the reader, buy the latest copy of Fanon's the translation of Wretched on the Earth. It's read the introduction by I forget his name. He's a very famous, beloved mainstream politician and activist. West, yes, Cornel West. Celebrating Fanon, not just celebrating Fanon, actually tying it to the Palestinians and Iran. So even in the introduction, Cornel West itself knows the affinity that this is what Palestinian brothers, he calls them, are doing. And this is what Ali Shariati, one of the main ideologues of Iranian Islamism, he also belongs to that camp. So I would say they actually knew and understood, a lot of these activists understood this better than a lot of us for a long time.
Okay. There's a zillion questions that come out of this, but I want to now pause and bring in Professor Maghen. Professor Maghen, what do you make of the argument? What did you make of the essay?
Hussein Aboubakr Mansour's innovative thesis in this surprisingly well-written essay. I say surprisingly well-written, not in reference to the author's own oeuvre, of course, but relative to so much abjectly unreadable academic writing in recent decades. His thesis is that what went wrong with the Middle East and Islam in the modern period is not, as the conventional wisdom would have it, that the states and societies of this region retreated into a traditional religious cocoon in reaction to the challenge of enlightenment, erecting all types of barriers against the incursion of Western ideas and institutions, but rather just the opposite. That it was specifically as it were, overeager Arab-Muslim adoption of those Occidental ideas and institutions, but as the author himself just said, of the hyped-up Central European romantic and historicist ilk, as opposed to the original Western European rationalist liberal brand that led to the jihadist monster that we confront today. It's a highly perspicacious argument, almost Copernican in its counterintuitivity. I find aspects of it quite compelling. Indeed, the essay prompted me to start thinking about a whole slew of ways in which Islamism constitutes a positive reaction and not just a negative backlash to modernity, including the impact of the scientific method on Muslim religious law and praxis, which, as you know, for centuries was extremely flexible, not to say lax, and which I am now starting to believe, under the influence of the exposure to the unforgiving binary 0 or 1 logic of Newtonian physics, rigidified significantly, eventually bringing upon us Islamic fundamentalism and ISIS. This is, as it were, another wing of the process that Aboubakr Mansour is describing, and his whole conceptualization is profoundly instructive and, I would say, an excellent corrective. That having been said, it would be utterly un-Jewish of me to agree with his thesis wholeheartedly. Being contrary is virtually one of the 10 commandments, and at any rate, if I did not take issue with at least some elements of the author's outlook, then we'd have, that same Gleichschaltung, or uniformity of belief, that Mansour so justifiably condemns. So where do I differ from the author's position? First of all, were I a Saidian anti-Orientalist, which I most decidedly am not, I might accuse the author of at least a whiff of Western paternalism, because he's essentially portraying Middle Eastern intellectual elites as incapable of coming up with their own ideas at all. Even what looks prima facie like a reversion to Islamic authenticity is in actuality, as I read his argument, really just a jump from servility to one Western philosophical operating system to servility to another Western philosophical operating system. Now, I get it. Not everything is what it seems, and Aboubakr Mansour would not be the first analyst to claim that, to quote Ramin Jahan Beglu, even the battle against modernity is ultimately modern, by which this postmodernist Iranian scholar in exile means that the epistemic tools employed in latter-day Middle Eastern nativism and anti-imperialism and the search for cultural autarky were themselves inherited, directly or indirectly, from the milieu of those self-same European colonizer. Aboubakr Mansour goes even further than this, averring that not only the motivations and methodology of the Arab Islamist revolutionaries are modern, their goals, he would seem to be saying, are modern as well. And here I think he goes a bit too far. First of all, contemporary Occidental society does not have a monopoly on the concept of the return to authentic roots, such that the Islamists would had to borrow this concept from Europe or America. The idea of refreshing and revitalizing religion is as old as the hills, and Islamic history in particular has been witness to dozens of instances of this idea being put into practice, from the medieval Muwahhidun in Spain and North Africa down to the 18th century Wahhabism of Arabia, both entirely indigenous Middle Eastern jihadist movements needing and receiving no help whatsoever from the West. Salafism, meaning the return to the pure religious doctrines of the founders of the faith, the Salaf al-Salih, is no more a new phenomenon in Islam than is jihadism, and would indeed appear to be woven into the religion's DNA. Inna Allah Azza wa Jal yabathu lihadhi al-ummah ala ra'si kulli ma'ati sanatin man yujaddidu liha dinaha. God the Exalted, it was said in the name of Muhammad, in what is clearly more of a kind of post-facto historical reflection than a prophetic prediction, God the Exalted sends down to the Muslim nation at the turn of each preceding century an individual who renews and revives their creed. There's a deeper issue at play here, however. You American liberals, and in particular I would venture the Mosaic crowd, sorry for the overgeneralization, have ever and anon seen your collective nemesis as German-rooted totalitarianism, whether of the fascist or socialist iteration. That's the good fight in your eyes. It's your favorite fight. and it's the fight you know how to fight. So what better way to conceive of our Islamist enemies today, and they are certainly our enemies. I'm sitting here in Israel. I promise you there are enemies. There are the enemies of the West, the enemies of civilization in general. But what better way to conceive of our Islamist enemies than as Nazi communists in disguise? And listen, whatever works. I'm all for propagandizing for the sake of victory as long as we don't end up believing our own propaganda. In this particular case, I feel that casting jihadists as totalitarians in turbans or woke progressives in burqas, and I certainly don't deny the current marriage of convenience between the two, will ultimately render us ignorant of our enemies' true worldviews and aspirations, because it just ain't so. The process detailed so eruditely by Aboubakr Mansour in this essay did in fact take place in the Middle East in the latter half of the 20th century, but I would aver it has by now largely run its course. Today we are faced, and this may also strike most of you as heavily counterintuitive, but I see evidence of it everywhere. Today in the Muslim world, we are faced with nothing so much as a genuine return to authentic, traditional, old-time religion. Now, the fact that Grandpa's Islam now exploits state-of-the-art military and communications technology in order to achieve its age-old jihadist and Taoist goals doesn't change that fact. And battling, or at least coming to terms with old-time religion, i.e. genuine, legalist, ritualistic, textually oriented, Semitic-based, biblically derived, believing Islam, requires a whole different set of strategies than the battle between right and left, or between liberalism and totalitarianism. Well, let me sum up by just trying to support my claim with one example from the Iranian revolutionary scene. One of the religio-cultural processes, as you gentlemen know at least as well as I, that accompanied the build-up to the Khomeinist revolution and the decade or so following was the transformation of the figure of Hussein, our author's namesake and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. At the outset, from the beginning, from the moment of the martyrdom of Hussein in the year 680, the Shiites perceived this third imam of theirs as a Christ figure. And increasingly over time, the obligatory commandment or observance that one was to carry out as a Shiite was to cry over Hussein's fate, and by doing so, you would receive absolution for your sins. He was simply Jesus in that sense. So much so that, in fact, his mother, Muhammad's daughter Fatima, was known in Persian as Madar Pedarash, and in Arabic as Abiha, the mother of her father, because Hussein was perceived almost as, the father incarnated into the son. Sometime in the 1960s and 70s, to make a long story short, this Hussein as Jesus was transformed by looking back at the sources and discovering that, in fact, he had not gone willingly to his death like Jesus to the cross. He actually wanted to win in his battle against the Umayyads. He was transformed into Che Guevara, right? Hussein, from Jesus into Che Guevara. And now he was supposed to influence the Shiites and Muslims in general to fight the good anti-imperialist fight, etc. And this was true for decades. Once you got into the new millennium, the new Christian millennium, from everything I've seen, Hussein is going back to becoming Jesus again. The madrasas in Iran and in other places are going back to the traditional versions of their pedagogy, of the analysis of their texts. Fatima, who had become this, feminist kind of, not Joan of Arc, I want to say Dolores Ibaruri, right? No pasaran, has now become Fatima again. not feminist in the least. And the newfangled holidays that the Islamic Republic kind of tried to get the people passionate about have all but disappeared. They're there, but nobody shows up. On the other hand, when it comes to the Arba'in of Hussein, the 40 days after Hussein's death, 6 million Iranians just 2 years ago got up and walked across the border to Iraq in order to get to Karbala and observe the ceremony. So what I'm trying to say is, and I think that Hussein Aboubakr Mansour alluded to this when he talked about how hollow, he specifically used the word, how hollow this new identity is. The new woke, progressive, kind of German-derived new identity is, and it is hollow. And I think that Muslim populations, activist populations, have discovered how hollow it is. This is something that happens very regularly. And after the revolutionary stage, what you have now in Iran, for instance, is a revolutionary regime that is the custodian of the return of good old time religion. I'll just end by saying that anyone, we say in Hebrew, lehavdil, not trying to actually compare the two, but this actually happens in my country. Zionism was a kind of secularized, even Bolshevized version of Jewish traditional messianism. And it helped us build a country, no question about it. Now, that's almost completely gone. And the Jewish Zionist state has become the custodian of what is essentially a return to good old time Jewish traditional exilic religion here in the land of Israel. I think it's a phenomenon that happens a lot. And the reason I'm harping on this, Hussein, is because I learned a great deal from your essay, but I do not want to run away from the fact that what faces us today is Islam. And Islam is an extremely powerful beacon for a lot of reasons. And I think that we need to look at that as the force that we need to reckon with.
Professor Maghen, thank you. Professor Haykel, I'm going to come to you in just a minute, but Hussein, why don't you respond briefly?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Maghen, for taking the time and for articulating such a strong opposition. I'll try to go through your points very quickly. Of course, the lack of originality is a problem. I mean, ultimately, well, this is going to be maybe the subject of another essay. I mean, that's really the anxiety and the self-destruction of post-colonial Arab intellectuals by the late 60s. Kind of the discovery that, in the words of Tayyip Saleh in his famous novel, were self-made lies. That basically, all of this we're just pretending to be Germans. And this was explicit in the various works of Arab intellectuals. I'm not saying that, I'm not here trying to dig in further into the Arab intellectuals. Even your crisis is a false pathos. Even your crisis is mimetic. I'm writing this as an Arab. I'm myself kind of angry. I don't think that they lack the capacity of originality. They refuse to do so. Those are two different things. I actually give them the agency. Being attracted to a false idol, that's your fault. By the end of the day, that you have, I do believe 100% that we as Arab intellectuals, we have the capacity to think for ourselves. But just a lot of people refuse to do so. It's a problem that exists for everyone. They would rather go to Harvard and Columbia and join this amazing tradition of traditions of resentful knowledge than actually articulate away from it something themselves. And we see this happening. I mean, the fights over Columbia have uncovered also the.
By the way, Hussein, one might just say, to interject, that it's understandable why they might be attracted to that tradition of knowledge because of the role that it has, the role in which they play in the unfolding story.
Saviors. They are the post-colonial savior who are gonna end patriarchy, who are gonna end Western oppression. I mean, the people wrote about this, basically the transformation of Marxist theory, from the proletariat as savior to the new, like, post-colonial, either the migrant, the man of color, the woman, the homosexual, so on and so forth. So yeah, it gave them this salvific role. Now about the propaganda,
so that the liberation of Palestine has these cosmic messianic consequences.
Read the articles on the publications of the left. There's a book that came out recently. The destruction of Gaza is the destruction of the earth. It's a crime against humanity. The genocide, of course, the charge of genocide also encapsulates all of this. This is just a war against the entirety of mankind. Saving the Palestinians is saving mankind. So no, these structures of thought are deeply attractive. And by the way, not just for Arabs. I mean, we're struggling with it right now. I would rather us not to talk about, like, oh, this is convenient propaganda to say they are fascists, and it's just this is an endless light of thought, because I can just turn the table on you and say, well, you're basically making a propaganda in order to say, oh, we Jews and the West are engaged in this existential battle in this alliance against an existential threat called Islam. So I can tell you that this is Zionist propaganda. So there's no point. I don't think you're propagandizing. I don't think I'm propagandizing. We have genuinely different readings of what's been happening in the Middle East. Now, about your argument, I think you're basically redoubling down on the idea that Islam is the problem, and I think you fundamentally, part of what I believe is your mistake was Bernard Lewis's mistake, that you basically fundamentally underestimate the massive changes of that modern society, some of them irreversible completely, brought into all societies. Not just some irreversible changes, some changes that are so profound and so dramatic that was inconceivable. I'll give one example or maybe two examples from Western societies, because by the end of the day, we believe that we're all human. The Arabs are ultimately the same human stock as somebody here. If these German ideology or German-derived, and by the way, I have nothing against Germany. I use German because it's just historical fact. It's the source, but it's not German anymore. It's truly everybody now peddles this. If these ideologies are so powerful as to warp the very sense of biological reality of Westerners, who can no longer even know what is a man and a woman. Think about this. I mean, forget about Islam, forget about Christianity, forget about Judaism, forget about the knowledge that is inherited in these books. There is nothing more basic than the material reality fact of your own body. These ideas are so powerful that it even blinds people. It completely distorts their own sense of their own body. That's how powerful they are. So their ability to completely disfigure major historical forms of knowledge, such as Islam, should not be underestimated.
But Hussein, if I might just interject regarding that, I mean, a couple of months ago in Dearborn, Michigan, maybe it was a little longer ago, there was a demonstration of evangelical Christians and Muslims holding hands together and heading toward the local library in order to take out all of the books that had to do with LGBTQ. I think that the current marriage of convenience between those who, as you put it, have blurred the distinction between the male and the female, etc., and Islam is only a marriage of convenience. And I think we see that throughout the Middle East in terms of the treatment of homosexuals. And when you talk about anti-Semitism, why are you unwilling to grant the power of Quranic anti-Semitism its due? We don't need Heideggerian or German-derived anti-Semitism to attribute to Muslims who have gone back lock, stock, and barrel to their texts, to which they have access for the first time in history via the internet, and they open it up, and Jews are everywhere there, and 99% of what is written about them is fiercely negative. Why would you deny them the agency of using their own texts to come to those conclusions?
I'm definitely not denying, and I'm not denying that both Islam and Christianity have a very long tradition of anti-Jewish hatred that really definitely does affect the appearance of modern anti-Semitism in the 19th century. But modern anti-Semitism is a specific and different, essentially and fundamentally different phenomenon that these traditional forms of anti-Jewish hatred, and even Bernard Lewis, this point, I think Bernard Lewis completely agrees with this in his, for example, Semites and anti-Semites, that basically classical Muslim approach towards Jews was that of contempt and dismissal. You live in your corner of society rather than conspiratorial obsession that leads to these genocidal intents. And that's a fundamental difference. And by the way, this also applies to everything else you said. I'm not denying we're all humans. We're all humans in the past. We're going to be humans in the future. I'm not denying that murder and rage and violence and rape, those are not found in Islamic history. And imperialism, of course, it's found in Muslim history. It's found in many nations. What is fundamentally different, maybe I'll close with this. What's fundamentally different is that these things themselves were not considered the theological locus of final salvation. And that's the difference between a murderous rage of a person in the 15th century, let's say, or the 13th century in a pogrom against Jews in southern Spain, and what's happening today through these phenonial texts, that the murderous rage itself is reconceptualized as the very vehicle of self-fulfillment and of salvation and of ending history. Those are that's the point. That's two different things. I'm not denying that violence didn't exist. It existed, but it did not have this heavy existential meaning that it acquired today.
Okay, Professor Haykel, thank you for your patience. Eager to know what you made of Hussein's argument in the essay.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. And I think I'm at a disadvantage coming last because Professor Maghen spoke so eloquently. So first, let me say, I mean, when I read the essay and I hadn't finished it yet, I found it really very interesting, very innovative, and I started sending it to colleagues and to students. And it also resonates with some of what I say when I teach, which is that if you look at the modern Middle East, the modern Arab world, if you look at Islamists, that, they are products of modernity. They're also very Western in many of their ideas without necessarily being self-conscious of being heirs to those traditions. And so I think it's quite compelling. What I hadn't focused on before was the specific German philosophical tradition that you detailed and you outlined. I'd always thought that in the Middle East, in the Arab world, but not only in the Arab world, that the French model and also the German model to some extent, but particularly the French model, was extremely powerful. Namely that when Arabs and Muslims looked to the West and tried to explain why the West was so powerful, aside from, their competence in military organization and industrial capacity, they saw the state. And they saw a very powerful state, and they saw the state as the agent of the transformation of these societies, a centralized state. And that was something that, is not indigenous to the Islamic world, certainly not when it comes to the production of law, for instance. Law is a private affair in the Muslim world. It came from, the ulama, who were kind of like rabbis. They produced the law, and in fact, the state adopted and deferred to them. The French model is very different. The German model also, when it comes to law, is very different. It's sort of top down rather than bottom up. And that is a major rupture in the tradition. So I appreciated all of that. Let me turn to some of my kind of differences with you. The first is that the state is sort of absent in your article, and I would like you to look at it and to think about it, and to think also about how what role it performed. The second is your repeated use of the term nihilism. And you often describe the jihadists and many Islamists as nihilists. So I have a difference of opinion here. Nihilists believe in nothing. I mean, they engage in violence, or they do whatever it is that they do because they have no project, they have no vision. They're basically, people who believe in nothing. Islamists have a project. Jihadists have a project. We may not like their project, but I don't think of them ever as being nihilists. Often that's we fall into the trap of calling them nihilists because their violence is so outrageous and so seemingly pointless. But I don't think the word nihilist or the concept nihilist quite captures them. The next thing I would say, and I think this is something that Professor Maghen also raised, which is that, and this is where I think you should be very careful, because the post-colonial also places the West as kind of the principal agent, the principal actor, and you don't want to do that, because I do think that you want to think of different intellectuals, different groups as having their own agency. Not that you're denying them agency, but you somehow say that they're heirs of a Western philosophical tradition, and you end up conflating sort of Islamists with with other groups, other authoritarians, totalitarians like the Ba'ath or type groups. And I think that there are significant distinctions between them. So the West is extremely important, of course, but it's not the only source of their ideas, and they go back to their traditions. They cherry pick, especially Islamists, they cherry pick the traditions in certain ways to fit a project that is theirs. Now, everything that they're doing is modern, right? And it's a rupture with the past. And the biggest rupture is their conception of the state, and they're wanting to take over the state in order to use it as a kind of instrument for dominating and controlling society and imposing law from above, as I said earlier. I think the next point I would raise with you is there is another tradition in the Middle East which you seem to not have focused on very much. And that is, the tradition of people like Naguib Mahfouz or, say, Amin Ma'louf, or even the kind of liberals of the 20s. I mean, there were other options and other possibilities and other strains of thought that had come into the Arab world. And the question is, what happened to these people? Why are they in exile often, like Amin Ma'louf? Or why did those ideas not take root? And here I think the state is a crucial factor in explaining the loss of kind of, let's call it the liberal humanist tradition, which can also find echoes in the Islamic past. So bringing those people in, I think, is important. Again, I think here one difference I would have with you is that I wouldn't place Mahmoud Darwish, as you seem to do in the essay. You describe his poems as weapons, I think, and so on. I have a different reading of Darwish, as I do, by the way, of Hassan al-Banna and of Qutb. I don't think Hassan al-Banna actually had a concept of the vanguard. I think that came with Qutb. But I may be wrong, but I suspect it's more Qutbist than it is from Banna. But certainly, everything else about the Muslim Brotherhood, the way they organize themselves, the way they, was very clearly very fascistic. And they were influenced by the fascists, like many others were, by the way, including the Lebanese Phalange here in Lebanon, where I'm speaking, and the Syrian, the Syrian National Party as well, and many others. So I think that's also a point that you need to kind of keep in mind about this. And I'm not an expert on the German philosophical tradition, but I'm not sure if, was Konstantin Zurek a Spenglerian or was he a neo-Kantian? Was he more Kantian? I have a vague recollection that he attacked Spengler, but maybe I'm wrong. Again, I mean, these are like little points, but what I would strongly encourage you to do is to build on this. I mean, I think in this essay, there's a nucleus for a tremendous book that needs to be written, and you're obviously very capable of doing this. Lastly, the last point I would make, and this is a point that I'm coming back to because I already made it. If you look at Paul Berman, when he wrote, I think it was it Islam and Liberalism right after the 9/11, my recollection, and he read Qutb very carefully, he seemed to have conflated the Islamists with the totalitarians like Saddam, which basically ended up meaning that liberals in America could team up with neoconservatives and fight this kind of evil in the Middle East that's essentially Nazism, right? I mean, what you're seeing is essentially these neo-Nazis. And so it's a continuation of the long battle against fascism. I have a problem with, that kind of oversimplification and conflation of the different groups, different individuals. And also, I have a real fear about the violent potentials that can result from conceptualizing modern Arab intellectual history in that way. I hope you find these comments helpful.
Hussein, go on.
Of course, I found them very helpful. Thank you very much, Professor Haykel. I really appreciate everything you said, and I appreciate you taking the time to read this, even though you haven't finished it, and being with us today. No, you've made excellent remarks. First of all, let me start by a little apologizing. There's only so much.
I read the whole essay. No, sorry, I absolutely read the whole essay. I just said that I shared it before I finished reading it because I found it so exciting.
Oh, thank you. That's even. Let me just start with an apologetic. I already, when I was working with the Mosaic staff on this, I already maybe forced them to double the length that they actually envisioned at the beginning. There's only so much you can do in this long essay. As you said, this actually has to be a book. I've been working actually on the book for quite some time, and I actually have many answers. Or my answers are actually the major questions that you raised. Of course, it started with France. For 100 years, the locus of modernization was actually French thought, French translation from the French. Of course, because history is central, or the concept of history is central to this, I will trace the emergence of the modern idea of history in the Arab world and how it was really positivist from the French. The first ever document that talks about universal history in Arabic are the first 5 pages, for instance, of the extraction of gold, the famous extraction of gold by Rifat Tahtawi, and it's you read it in the completely positivist French vision of the universal history, and that line of thought does culminate in what Albert Hourani famously called the liberal age. How did that end is exactly the story that I'm trying to tell. That basically these specific totalitarian philosophies, they invade really the world in the interwar years. And this happened not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe. I mean, ultimately it was, and it ended in World War II with the rise of as we all know. So basically what happened is that there was a culture war, that its history is completely forgotten. So this part, I don't think it's theorized by a lot of people, or even has been written by historians, because a lot of this hasn't been explored yet because of our distortions of vision. There was actually an active culture war, specifically from the 1940s, that ended in the mid-50s to completely destroy what the new radical Arab intellectuals called the bourgeois, bro-British, Taha Hussein, and so on and so forth. And there were battles, and the way to see this is exactly the invasion of this new radical way of thinking that saw these earlier stage of Arab thinkers who were more democratic in their aspirations, more liberal in their aspirations, saw them as colonial, pro-feudalism, so on and so forth. So I hope this kind of gives just a hint of the way that I see this happen. And ultimately, this new radicalism eradicated that liberal epistemology and acquired the meaning of revolution and progress the way that they became. That's it. The agency, you're right. I think it's our own tendency, because of just how modern thought, especially after post-colonial theory, have been organized, that we always tend to look for victims. We always tend to look for perpetrators. I insist on, in everything I write, this is a story where we're all perpetrators. That's how I'm kind of a religious person. So the way I see that we're all actually collaborate equally in creating disasters. So I see it, I see basically the post-Christian European intellectual in some places created these terrible ideas, convinced maybe, some Jewish radical intellectuals to spread them. A Christian Levantine intellectual translated them to Arabic. A Muslim intellectual liked them and actually made them into an intellectual program. It's a collaborative effort that we have done together.
Hussein, can you say something about the state?
Oh, the state, of course, yeah. No, you're absolutely right, of course, and the idea of the state as the engine of modernization and building, and that's not just this the whole post-colonial world for various reasons. I also don't want to make this a purely intellectual story, but there is a fundamental difference between the state as the main organ of organizing society and law and dispensing rights, which is indeed a version of the liberal state. I mean, America is unique in the way it thinks about the state. But the French definitely think about it this way. France is the mother of the French people. You see it in the French patriotic art of the 19th century. The French as the mother suckling, and the French people are children suckling from her breasts, and so on and so forth. And definitely that went into the Middle East. Now, the Hegelian idea of the state is very different. And the Hegelian idea of the state makes the state a metaphysical principle that is necessary for your existence itself. That is, if you can't fulfill yourself in a state that is expressive of your identity, then you have no real historical existence. And what I want to say is that influence, I mean, the idea, there's a difference between Islamists, and there are many distinctions. I agree that I'm not making enough distinctions, but it's just because of the nature of the condensation that I have to do. There's a difference between the Islamist who thinks that it's important to take the state in order to reorganize society more well, and the Islamist who thinks that Islam cannot exist without a state. That is, Islam is a state of non-being, as long as there is no caliphate or no state. And you know that this has been a major idea in the Islamist circle. What I claim that the origin of this idea is Hegelian. There is no other, as you said, that doesn't even exist in classical Islam, Muslim
How do we
knowledge.
get to that, Hussein? I mean, we've had the connection between state and religion in Islam from the very beginning. The Prophet Muhammad himself.
You're assuming a separation
in himself.
You're making the connection. Even your question assumes that's the problem of discussing this. Your question itself already based on the modern epistemology. You said the connection between state and religion as if there were a state and religion before the 19th century. There were not.
I think that the Abbasid state was a state. I think the Ayyubid state was a state. I think that the Muhammadan state, the Rashidun state, I think all of them, the Seljuk state, the Ottoman state, I think they were all states. I think that they were all Islamic states in very many ways. I do understand that modernity contributed added dimensions to this, which were imbibed by Arab and Muslim intellectuals. All I'm asking, and I really think you've made a major contribution that I agree also could turn into a book. Originally Urabi Pasha to Saad Zaghlul, nationalist, liberal, the Pharaonic party, and all of that, moving up into what were basically fascists and communists taking over the youth groups of the Middle East in kind of the mid-20th century, is all reflected, as you say, in the literature and in the philosophy. I'm with you completely on that. I just think that we've moved on to a third stage of retrenchment that it's very important to take into account. I think that the Islamists may have begun with a hollow mimicry of Western ideologies that may even have ignited their passions and their very existence. But from that, they have almost perforce gone back to their actual Islamic roots. And I have heard preachers day in and day out, Egyptian preachers, Iranian preachers throughout the Muslim world over the last few decades, specifically addressing themselves to this and saying, once upon a time, our Islam was not real. It was some kind of mimicry, even the Islam that we brought back. Now, let's go back and let's be real Salafists, right? And I think Salafism should be taken seriously.
I didn't talk about Salafism, of course, in the essay for a very important reason, because obviously it's more complex. You have the truly real phenomena of religious fundamentalism, and that's also different. And
that could be the next chapter in your book.
But
The chapter in which Muslims actually realized what you are saying. They realize what you are saying and how hollow it is. And they're actually going back to their own genuine, authentic roots.
Let me say something, Ze'ev. I don't disagree with you that these are bad ideas. Like I don't disagree with you that those imams are terrible, are a scourge to their societies in the world. I completely
I'm not discussing whether they're good or bad.
I completely agree with you.
That
no, it's bad. Let's be clear. It's terrible.
Fine with me.
It's terrible. What they are saying, basically, is also itself another layers of mimicry, and that's the point. That is, even authenticity itself is a Heideggerian idea. It didn't exist in Arabic in the 19th century.
That I tried to debate with you before. I can't. Heidegger did not make up authenticity any more than Rousseau made up nature.
If I may say something. That return to roots and authenticity was also a universal phenomenon, not just in the Muslim world, by the late 1960s. Everybody was talking about authenticity here. There was a major TV show, if you remember, in America. It's actually, I know it from Egypt because people used to watch it. It was called Roots. Sure. It was called Roots, and it was about, I think, slaves who will go back to their roots in Africa and so on. It was the era of Black Power. You had African Americans making up these new African-sounding names that are not really African, but in order to go back to the authenticity. So even those imams who are saying, "Oh, we've been hollow and mimics," this is also part of the post-colonial.
Why won't you grant them the possibility that the Wahhabists were not mimics? They weren't mimics.
No, the Wahhabists. Yeah, true. The Wahhabists are different.
They wanted to go back to authenticity and to the pure Islam, and they started. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab at the end of the 18th century encounters Hadith for the first time in his life. He was a Sufi, and he gets to Mecca and he starts reading Hadith, and he says, "For crying out loud, we've been doing it wrong the entire time. We've forgotten our roots.
Let's be completely honest. You're committed to a story. That's basically how it sounds to me. You're committed to a story that Islam is bad. Islam is the problem. I think.
Wait a second. I never said Islam is bad or Islam is the problem. I actually think
that's what you said. You said they went back to real Islam, and that's the threat.
In many ways, I think that Islam could be that recognition that Islam is, by the way, a religion that
it's a fantasy of Islam. It's a fantasy. I'm sorry. Let me say something very quickly. I hear. I work with a lot of right-wing Zionists. That's actually more all my career because the universities, honestly, a lot of them. Sorry, Professor Haykel, not you, but a lot of the universities became a terrible place, and they canceled me. And they're just. I work, and I hear a lot of people talking about this Islam all the time. Oh, we have to learn how to deal with Islam. You have to. It doesn't exist. There is that Islam. Is a fantasy.
People who are putting on hijab again, and
they are a billion people.
Sources again, and
they are different societies.
They again don't exist, and they're just a mimicry of Western ideas.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say putting the hijab.
That they want to eject Western ideas. You're going to tell them what they're.
My story is about intellectuals. My story is specifically about the intelligentsia. What I wrote in this, that's the thing. What I say again. There is a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern society works, the role of the university, the centrality of intellectuals, and the centrality of philosophy to the last 200 years. I'm not talking about the poor, my mother, or the poor Muslim woman. I'm talking about the intelligentsia.
The madrasa is overcoming the university.
Most Muslims don't go to madrasas anymore. Most Muslims don't go to madrasas anymore. They go to modern schools that are organized like Western education,
at Cairo
and they go to university.
At Cairo University, and you're interpreting me wrong if you think I'm saying there's anything bad about this. At Cairo University, in the middle of lectures, they stand up, and they belt out the azan, and everyone goes to pray,
I've been there,
including the professor.
Yes.
And also,
it's true.
Okay. So
this is
not happening.
Hussein, let me ask you a question, though. Oh, yeah, Professor Haykel, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, not related to the discussion we were just having, but I think you should also think, and this could help with your argument. You should also think about what's happening in a country like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So here you have states that essentially, are anti-Islamist, and Islam is a modern political ideology, right? They're not anti-Islam, they're anti kind of the ideologization of Islam as a modern kind of ideology and a party. And what they're trying to do, and they're both authoritarian, and they're trying to grapple with modernity and bring modernity in. In the case of Saudi Arabia, they're bringing in, philosophers. They now have major kind of philosophical conferences with all different types of Western philosophy represented. In the case of the UAE, they have this sort of, let's call it a neo-traditional form of Islam that's trying to draw back on Ash'arism and other, Ibn Bayya and the non-kind of Salafi traditions. And again, you have a state that's grappling with some of these big issues, but also intervening very directly in trying to direct society in very specific ways and to very specific ends and with very particular kind of ideas. And I think that's also part of the story that should be incorporated in what you're trying to do.
I agree. Thank you, Professor.
So let me just, Hussein, give you the last word, but I want to formulate the question that comes to mind as I'm listening to your discussion with Professor Maghen. Professor Maghen has a very sensible, defensible interpretation of what he hears, because the people who are advancing arguments in religious vocabulary and are acting in religious ways.
Right.
That's indisputable. You don't even disagree with that.
Of course. But
you are saying that some of them are operating on an operating system, that their thoughts are actually epiphenomenal upon a deeper current of intellectual influence. So I guess this is just the last question, a methodological question. Can you prove it? How would you really know if, despite the fact that they're advancing their religious arguments in religious language, it's in fact not religiously motivated?
That's a great question. First of all, let me say two caveats, tangentially related, and then I'm going to go into the questions. I also have a problem with, so in order actually to understand fully what I'm trying to say, I do believe we need to re-understand Nazism and communism. I don't subscribe to also the way that I dispute a lot of the produced knowledge about the Middle East in the last decades. I also dispute a lot of produced knowledge about European intellectual history itself. And I think what people think of as Nazism and communism are actually caricatures about what those two major world movements and philosophies have been. And you're not going to understand this part unless you actually reconceptualize this. And this is also answers the earlier question of Professor Haykel when he said, yeah, we're reducing this to, that's the point. I don't subscribe to the caricature of Nazism and communism. Not that I don't condemn them. I just think that they were bigger and much more deeper and problematic philosophies, really, in different ways that the liberal were completely underestimated and ultimately now is suffering from that underestimation. Now, the question of methodology. I am an eternal skeptic, so I do believe that you can't prove anything. I'm postmodern a little bit in that way, but I do believe that you can make a plausible case. You can make a compelling, plausible case. And ultimately, the compelling, plausible case, I do believe, would be through epistemic research in which you can trace stage by stage, decade by decade. You take one concept, let's say like jihad. You take one concept like history. You start from literature from the late 18th century, and you work your way through it. What did that mean in literature in that decade? What does it mean in the literature in that decade? And you walk your way through up till the end of the 20th century. And actually, that's the work that I did. This is where this comes from. And as I said, the book is gonna come out hopefully at one point in the near future. That basically you start tracing history, you start tracing jihad, you start tracing Sharia, you start tracing, which Professor Haykel was right about pointing the major eruptions. But you start tracing, and then you see the story that I'm saying. You see the change. It's a specific change. First of all, people who will do this, they also have to be competent in European philosophical history. And that's part of the problem, because you're talking about mastering major intellectual traditions. You see that French meaning that is acquired at the beginning, and then by the 1920s of the 20th century, you start seeing these new meanings. You start seeing their complete settlement by the 1950s, and their turn into mass culture. I tried to describe this in the essay: movies, songs, poems, so on and so forth. And then you see the re-Islamization, if you will, by the 1970s and 1980s. So I do believe that you can make a plausible, compelling case through this methodological study of texts, speeches, cultural artifact, and so on and so forth. And you see, and ultimately, as I said, I'm not trying to say that there is a victim here, people don't have agency. I'm actually trying to restore agency to everyone involved, and hopefully to also open a horizon beyond this wreckage of the post-Christian world that we're all now kind of trying to crawl out from underneath.
I think we should leave it there. The Enchantment of the Arab Mind was published in Mosaic on July 7th, 2025. Professor Haykel, Professor Maghen, Hussein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.